In July of 1862, after General George McClellan's failed Peninsula Campaign, Congress passed two very important pieces of legislation. The Militia Act of 1862, which gave President Lincoln the authority to employ persons of African descent in any military capacity which he saw fit, and the Second Confiscation Act. In Section 6 of that act, Congress gave the President the authority to seize, to confiscate all property of persons in states in rebellion, which included slaves. On September 22, 1862, 5 days after the Battle of Antietam, President Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, in which he warned the states in rebellion that if they did not lay down their arms and return to the Union in the next 100 days, he was going to declare free their slaves on January 1, 1863. In October 1862, Frederick Douglass wrote in his monthly that in order for the Emancipation Proclamation to free any slaves, two conditions had to be met. The first condition was that the states in rebellion still had to be in rebellion as of January 1, 1863. And the second condition was that the rebellion had to be suppressed. On January 1, 1863, that first condition was met, as the states in rebellion had not returned to the Union. And on January 1, 1863, President Lincoln issued the final Emancipation Proclamation as, quote, a fit and necessary war measure for suppressing said rebellion, close quote. President Lincoln made it very clear within its Emancipation Proclamation that that proclamation was a fit and necessary war measure for preserving the Union, for accomplishing the paramount objective of the war. And in that fit and necessary war measure for preserving the Union, President Lincoln declared forever free all persons held as slaves in the 10 states that were at war with the United States for their independence. In the 5 slaveholding states that accepted Abraham Lincoln as president, federal authority, the Emancipation Proclamation did not apply because Congress did not give President Lincoln the authority to seize property and declare free slaves in states that were loyal to the Union, only in states in rebellion, only in states that had to be brought back to the Union by military conquest. Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, told the Confederate legislature that the Emancipation Proclamation was, quote, an authentic statement by the government of the United States of its inability to subjugate the South by force of arms, close quote. Indeed, General Ulysses S. Grant would say that the Emancipation Proclamation added a powerful ally to the Union war effort. In January 1863, that regional conflict became a war for emancipation, a war for a new birth of freedom, as hundreds of thousands of Southerners, men and women of African descent, would join the Union war effort, seeking that precious gift of liberty. And this nation would march on to victory as one nation.
Between 1861 and 1865, some 2.8 million men fought in the Civil War. Most of these men were citizen soldiers, volunteers. Before the war, they held occupations like farmers, carpenters, blacksmiths, and common laborers. If they survived the war, they went back to those occupations after the hostilities closed. There was, however, a small cadre of officers, both in the Union and Confederacy, that were professionally military trained. And the school that these soldiers went to primarily was West Point and the Hudson River in New York. Founded in 1802, at the outbreak of the Civil War, this school had about 1,800 alumnus. And the living graduates participated both north and south at all levels of command. About 2/3 of the entire Army Officer Corps prior to the Civil War were graduates of West Point. Now, West Point wasn't the only school that a young man could seek a military education in this country before the war. There were schools like Norwich in Vermont, VMI in Lexington, Virginia, and the Citadel in South Carolina. But the school that produced the most officers would be West Point. On April 12, 1861, the fate of the nation changed forever when the Confederate commander at Charleston Harbor, a West Point graduate by the name of P.G.T. Beauregard, fired on the Federal garrison there under the command of Union Major Robert Anderson. Anderson had been Beauregard's artillery instructor at West Point. Thus, the war began by the firing of one student on his own teacher. What did men like Anderson and Beauregard learn at these military schools? And we'll take West Point here as our example because it's really the model for the other schools in the country. First of all, the cadets were appointed by Congress, much like they are today. They needed to pass basic physical requirements and educational requirements. Then a cadet would report to West Point in the summertime, where he would camp out and learn military drill. The academic year commenced in the fall, and the program was generally 4 years long. So in this 4-year program, a cadet would start his 4th year as a plebe, his 3rd year as a sophomore student, his 2nd year as a junior student, and his 1st year as a senior student. During the 4th year, or a cadet's plebe or 1st year at the military academy, he would study only 2 subjects, French and mathematics. You've got to understand here, the curriculum was very much geared toward engineering and science, since these officers, after their graduation, were expected to go on to build roads, canals, military fortifications, lighthouses, and other types of projects. During a cadet's 3rd class year or sophomore year, drawing would be added to the curriculum. During a cadet's 2nd class year or junior year, he would then study chemistry and philosophy. And during a cadet's 1st class year or senior year, he would study moral and political science, he would study rhetoric, and ironically, only 1 semester of his entire 4-year career at West Point would a cadet be exposed to military engineering and the science of war. Outside the classroom, cadets were also given instruction in infantry, cavalry, and artillery drill, as well as the use of the sword through fencing lessons. Cadets were not only graded on all of these, but also on their conduct. On graduation day, the cadets with the best overall records were commissioned as 2nd lieutenants in the engineers and in the artillery. Cadets with the lower scores were commissioned into the infantry. The impact of a military education like that offered at West Point on the overall conduct of the American Civil War has long been debated by scholars. There's no denying that having a military education like that at West Point was a true asset to officers on both sides of the American Civil War when it came to equipping, training, disciplining, and organizing armies in the war.
150 years after the Civil War, we continue to debate the legacy of the American Civil War. We ask questions about the proper scope of the federal government, we debate issues of nationalism, and perhaps most importantly, we continue to struggle and debate issues surrounding race in American history. Even before the guns fell silent, Americans struggled to come to terms with the legacy of the war. In November of 1863, Lincoln came here to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, to dedicate a new cemetery for those soldiers who gave the last full measure so that ultimately the Union would be preserved. But even during the immediate post-war years, the dead on both sides came to dominate how Americans chose to remember their Civil War. In addition to Gettysburg, other cemeteries where Union dead are buried came to symbolize the Union cause, the brave conduct of the men that ultimately left the Union preserved. Confederates also used their dead to commemorate the war and to structure early memory of the war, what came to be known as the Lost Cause. During the early post-war period, white Southerners sort of fashioned their memory of the war around the Confederate dead, but also around broader issues. The war had become a war about states' rights, as opposed to what many white Southerners argued defined the war early on, the issue of slavery. During this period, it really is the veterans on both sides who come to dominate the early memory of the war. Veterans begin to write memoirs and articles for newspapers, and both sides sort of struggled to defend their preferred interpretation of the war. They did so individually, and by the 1880s, they also did so collectively. For federal veterans, veterans of the North, they did so in GAR camps, Grand Army of the Republic camps. In many of these camps, it should be remembered that black veterans joined and were allowed to push for their own preferred interpretation. For black soldiers, veterans, and even for African Americans generally, they continued to push for an interpretation of the war that emphasized emancipation and the hopes of equality in a reconstructed Union. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, American memory was defined both by strong feelings of reunion and reconciliation, but also lingering feelings of bitterness between ex-Confederate and ex-Union soldiers. They came to battlefields like Gettysburg and other places to dedicate new monuments, shake hands here over the bloody angle, but it should never be forgotten that they did not forget about the causes for which they fought, even if they did not discuss them. By the early 20th century, groups like the Sons of Confederate Veterans and other groups throughout the North took up the mantle to promote, again, their preferred memory of the war. For groups like the United Daughters of the Confederacy, they remained very active through regulating textbooks and other publications to control what the next generation would learn about the American Civil War. By the early 1960s, Americans once again embraced the opportunity to remember their Civil War during the centennial celebrations. Americans did so through reenactments and other events that attracted large crowds. Many of these events tended to steer clear of some of those tough questions related to race and slavery that Americans throughout this period tended to ignore. But that became more and more difficult to do as Americans read in their newspapers and watched on television. They saw images of sit-ins and freedom riders. Our own sesquicentennial is defined by both continuity and change. On the one hand, we continue to remember and even embrace a very traditional view of the Civil War, defined by both the battles and the great leaders. But over the last few decades, Americans have been more willing to talk about some of the more divisive issues, such as race and emancipation. Movies such as Glory, and even more recently movies like Lincoln, have given Americans perhaps increased space to talk amongst themselves about the Civil War in a new light. And the hope, of course, in the end, is that those conversations help to unite us and even come to terms with what many Americans believe is the defining moment in its history.
The seeds of the Civil War were really sown when the Founding Fathers framed the Constitution. You're going to have an agreement in there, the 3/5 compromise, in which, slaves were sort of sometimes people or 3/5 of a person, and a series of compromises and issues throughout the 19th century, the first half of it, is going to only make that issue more and more complex. In 1820, trying to keep parity in the Senate between slave states and free states, you're going to have a compromise where one of each state enters the Union. You're going to have a slave uprising, Nat Turner's Rebellion, which is going to foment fears in the South about more slave uprisings. You're going to have a war with Mexico, which Yankees in the North would see as a war of Southern conquest, where you have people in the South starting to frame the argument that states should be able to decide whether they are free states or slave states. That's an interesting thing throughout this time. By 1840s, you're going to have this argument of us against them. It is North against South, South against North. It's the same country, they spoke the same language, but the perception of North and South was growing to make a wider gap. By the 1850s, you're going to have the Compromise of 1850, which is eventually going to destroy the parity in the Senate, but it's also going to forgive some debts for Southern states, as well as adding a fugitive slave law, which is going to force people who might even be against slavery to be complicit in it, to return slaves to their masters if they escape into non-slave holding areas. You were going to have, of course, Uncle Tom's Cabin come out, which is going to sell more than 1 million copies in the first couple of years. You are also going to have, of course, John Brown's Raid, which is just going to make these passions stronger, and these erupt into literally people bringing guns into the Senate chamber. You're going to have Kansas erupt into what is now known as Bleeding Kansas, where pro-slavery forces from Missouri come in and fight against anti-slavery forces from New England, and eventually this stuff will all erupt and come to a head in the election of 1860 when Abraham Lincoln, a Republican, a liberal Republican, who said he wasn't going to free any of the slaves or tamper with slavery where it already existed, was perceived by the South as being hostile to slavery, and that is the reason the Southern states gave as they seceded in 1860 and early to mid-1861, and the Civil War will begin at Fort Sumter in April 1861. After the firing on Fort Sumter, both sides, North and South, started to raise huge, enormous armies. The biggest armies in the world eventually will gather on this continent. You're going to have them gathering around Washington, D.C., and also in the West. The North immediately institutes a blockade of southern ports, which eventually will have a huge impact upon the South, especially given in the West a series of victories at Fort Donelson, at Shiloh, at the capture of Corinth, Mississippi, and eventually later in the war when Vicksburg falls and then Chattanooga falls, the South, especially in the West, is being shrunk, while you're going to have in the East a series of battles fought by a series of Northern commanders, generally against Confederate General Robert E. Lee, in which the troops are going back and forth from Manassas down to outside of Richmond, up toward Manassas again and Antietam, and then down in the Fredericksburg area, up to Gettysburg, and down slowly, inexorably toward Richmond. As the war wears on, the Southern territory is shrinking, the blockade is really working, and ultimately, by the end of the war, April 1865, Southern forces are compelled to surrender, namely at Appomattox and at Bennett's Place in North Carolina. And with the end of the Civil War also came the assassination of President Lincoln. Lincoln, who had emancipated the slaves as a war measure on the first day of 1863, who was so key in passing the 13th Amendment. But his assassination itself did not help relations between the North and the South. And he was just one of so many as a result of this conflict that would die. 620,000 dead as a result of this conflict. Some suggestions are that that number is way too low, actually. So it's important that we reflect back upon the Civil War, what it means to our country, and that is one of the reasons the Civil War Trust is so interested in saving so much battlefield land. 30 acres of battlefield land are lost to development every day.
The Battle of Gettysburg was the single bloodiest event to take place in the history of the American Civil War. When it was all said and done, over 10,000 Americans had lost their lives. And from all of this death and devastation, people began to ask themselves a number of important questions. First and foremost, what does it all mean? What are we to take from all of this death and carnage? Is the preservation of the Union, or the abolishment of slavery for that matter, truly worth all of this human loss? All of these questions would perhaps best be answered 4 months later in what would become one of the most famous speeches in all of world history. That speech would be the Gettysburg Address, delivered by President Abraham Lincoln right here on this hillside in Gettysburg. Lincoln was invited here for a November 19th dedication ceremony to dedicate this Soldiers' National Cemetery, the final resting place of over 3,500 Union soldiers who gave their lives in this battle. Lincoln is not the main speaker for this dedication ceremony, and thus he's going to keep his comments rather short and sweet. But he will eventually rise from the speaker's platform, and he will begin his address by stating that it had only been 87 years earlier that this nation had been established under the promise that all men are created equal. He later goes on to say how this awful Civil War was worth fighting. Lincoln realized that the fight for freedom in America had been altered here in this very spot. In Lincoln's view, the United States is the last best hope for free people on earth. And in his view, that was something that was worth fighting for. And he urges his fellow Americans to consider what is at stake. He speaks of this unfinished work which this nation must embark on, winning this awful Civil War. And indeed, the war would continue, claiming over 620,000 lives in the process, Abraham Lincoln being among the last of them. Many people in America in the 1860s don't have the basic rights of citizenship. They include women, African Americans, and Native Americans. Although they don't have the rights of citizenship at this time, it is Lincoln's words spoken here at Gettysburg that are embodied in their movements to obtain those basic American rights, such as casting their vote in an election, letting their voice be heard, and a free democracy. This was some of the work Abraham Lincoln spoke of. And in many ways, the unfinished work goes on to this very day. Wherever there is oppression, wherever there is injustice, there's work still left to be done. And this is the great task remaining, not only for the generation of the 1860s, but for all generations.
When the Civil War started, there were 5 Southern generals with the rank of full general. These were, in order, Samuel Cooper, the Adjutant General of the Confederacy. Because he was Adjutant General and he was an older guy that didn't have field command, you don't hear about him too much. Albert Sidney Johnston maintained the great confidence of Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, but was killed at the Battle of Shiloh, so we never really got to see what his true field command prowess was. Robert E. Lee, who would of course go on to become what has to be the most important and well-known of Confederate generals. The 4th, Joseph E. Johnston, who always thought he should have outranked Robert E. Lee, held several notable commands, can't claim a whole lot of victories on the Virginia Peninsula, in Mississippi, around Jackson, in falling back to Atlanta, but a notable and capable Southern commanders by all accounts. And P.G.T. Beauregard, hero of 1st Manassas or Bull Run. Several important commands all the way up the East Coast also fought at the second day of the Battle of Shiloh. And these, in a way, these remaining 3 Confederate commanders of full general rank, you would hear from them throughout the entire Civil War. Now, even the character of Southern generals were a little bit different. You don't have, like you do in the North, political generals rising to army command. Once in a long while, you're going to have them rise to divisional or even corps command. But generally speaking, you are going to have generals who went to West Point or to VMI or to the Citadel. Well-trained Confederate generals out in the field. These started to dwindle, of course, as the war went on. Now, below the full generals, there are several other notable generals, to say the least, who would have independent command throughout the Civil War. You're going to have some very well-known ones like Braxton Bragg. People don't necessarily know him positively. He can't claim a whole lot of successes other than victory in the second greatest battle of the Civil War at Chickamauga. You're going to have several others as well. John Bell Hood also did not do all that well in the West. And other commanders who rose to that occasion, Stonewall Jackson in the East, could certainly operate independently and with great success on occasion. James Longstreet, who was a great corps commander by most accounts, but really didn't succeed at independent command the way that some expected he might have been able to. Other Confederate commanders, Earl Van Dorn, the great cavalry commanders, Nathan Bedford Forrest, and Jeb Stuart also all added flamboyance and energy to the Southern cause wherever they went with their independent commands. And we have to mention Jubal Anderson Early, who broke away from Lee's main army and will actually invade the North, get into Maryland, and almost capture Washington, D.C. in 1864. And then on several other levels, there are other commanders who could hold semi-independent commands, who also commanded Confederate Corps, who you really have to recognize. Some of the greats, A.P. Hill, fiery A.P. Hill, and the always seemingly angry D.H. Hill. Patrick Cleburne, the great Southern Division commander, some say maybe the best Southern Division commander, who fought in the West and was killed in the Battle of Franklin. Leonidas Polk, Confederate Corps commander, who met his end outside of Atlanta, Georgia. Hardee, John B. Gordon, Dick Anderson, the list goes on and on. But I think there's something about both the character of the Southern general, the well-trained, well-disciplined, willing to take chances Southern general, that characterizes the Southern high command as a little bit different from the North. Something else you find about the Southern generalship is they did not have quite the pool of resources that the North had. The North had more trained military commanders. It took them a little longer to find them, but they could eventually replace some others at the high command. The South, once they lost a Stonewall Jackson, once they lost certain other commanders, they really had a tough time replacing those men.
The Western theater of the Civil War, the forgotten theater of the war. A couple of aspects about the Western theater that they're very crucial to the war's outcome, and I think for far too long have been ignored or underplayed. The war begins in the spring of 1862, places like Fort Donelson and Shiloh. Shiloh is the first major battle of the war that really awakens the American public to the idea that this war is going to be particularly costly, brutal, and last much longer than was anticipated. But Shiloh also allows 2 characters to ultimately survive and rise up and have a major impact in the ultimate Union victory, which is Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman. Without those 2, victory by Union forces I think is much more questionable. Plus, you also have great strategic victories. I think it is hard to argue against the impacts of victories such as Vicksburg and Chattanooga, and even Atlanta for U.S. forces. Vicksburg splits the Confederacy in two. Chattanooga seals Tennessee's fate once and for all and opens up Georgia to an invasion by Sherman's forces. Atlanta ultimately helps re-elect Abraham Lincoln to a second term. Plus, the Western Theater, from the Mississippi to the Appalachian Mountains, is a much broader and greater strategic area. There's much more naval action in the Western Theater along the coastlines of Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina. These are all areas that have so much to do with how the war progresses. And let's face it, the battles in the Western Theater, from Shiloh to Murfreesboro, Atlanta, Chickamauga, the second highest casualty total of any battle in the war, behind only Gettysburg, had much to do with how the war was progressing. And to go back to Grant especially, Robert E. Lee in the East had defeated one federal general after another. It was only when Grant, who had made his career in the West, was brought east that the Eastern Theater began to turn in favor of the U.S. forces. And when Grant went east, Sherman stayed west and began to apply the final nails to the coffin of the Confederacy. So I don't think there's any way to downplay the significance. Would I say that the Western Theater is more important than the Eastern Theater? I might say that in jest sometimes, but I think it's at the very least, the equal to the East, and for too long has been relegated to second place. And I think the men who fought here on both sides deserved a fate better than to be looked upon as of second importance. So the Western Theater is the forgotten theater, and it's my hope that that changes in the years to come.
Throughout the course of the American Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln was both blessed and cursed by a variety of leaders that served under his command. But in the Eastern Theater of the war, at the beginning of the conflict, things didn't necessarily get off to a great start for him. This is all rooted in the Union defeat at the Battle of First Bull Run, where the Northern troops under the command of General Irvin McDowell were soundly defeated and routed all the way back to the capital city. This defeat in part gave rise to one of the most prominent leaders in the Union Army of the Potomac, General George B. McClellan, known as the Young Napoleon, or Little Mac, in a beloved nature by his men who had great affection for this general. In the summer of 1862, McClellan attempted to capture the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia, but there he was driven back. Later that summer, under the command of General John Pope, the Union Army suffered another major defeat, this time at Manassas once again, thus leading to the return of George McClellan as the commander of the Union Army. And in this capacity, he would take his army to Sharpsburg, Maryland, where they would engage in the deadliest fight, the deadliest day of the American Civil War, at the Battle of Antietam. Although this strategic victory gave Lincoln political leverage to release a preliminary version of his Emancipation Proclamation, he was nevertheless frustrated by McClellan's seemingly cautious nature. So once again, McClellan was out, and in came General Ambrose Burnside. Lincoln had high hopes for General Burnside, but he too met defeat at the Battle of Fredericksburg in December of 1862. As did his successor at the Battle of Chancellorsville in May 1863. Things were looking very bleak for the Union Army in the Eastern Theater, but things took a turn that summer when a Pennsylvanian by the name of General George Gordon Meade took command of the Union Army of the Potomac. And here at Gettysburg, in this farmhouse, he made one of the most important command decisions of his life that ultimately gave him a huge victory here on Northern soil. In the Western Theater of the war, Union forces are meeting success, but they're meeting it a little bit earlier. And this is in large part due to the cunning leadership of General Ulysses S. Grant. Grant scores a number of victories for the North throughout this time, including Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, the Battle of Shiloh, Champion Hill, Vicksburg, and Chattanooga. Grant's success in the West will ultimately lead to his promotion as overall commander of all Union forces. At this time, Ulysses Grant is working with a number of generals and developing partnerships with them. These include notable leaders such as William Tecumseh Sherman, who will lead his famous March to the Sea in 1864, and also Philip Bates Sheridan, a cavalryman who will lead his infamous raids into the Virginia's Shenandoah Valley, also in 1864. Other notable leaders in the Western theater of the conflict include General George H. Thomas, known as the Rock of Chickamauga for his firm stand at that battle. They also include William Rosecrans and Henry Halleck. So, as Grant took command, he had capable commanders in both the Eastern and the Western theater of the war. In the East, he has General George Meade directing the Union Army of the Potomac, while out west, William Tecumseh Sherman is directing several Union armies in their campaigns against Confederate forces. Whether these Union leaders fought in Virginia or Tennessee, their collective efforts ultimately helped batter the Confederacy into submission and helped preserve the United States.